How you doing? I'm Ben, and I like to draw, paint, and sculpt, particularly in this stylized way. And today I want to talk about line weight and line work, specifically some of the key tips and tricks that have helped me go from boring and flat line work to more interesting and dynamic. Now I'm going to be explaining these line work tips through these 3D shapes, alongside some illustrations to give you context, not just how-tos, but more so how I'm thinking. I'm going to give you an example of how I might study another artist's line work. I'm going to share one of my favorite techniques that I call a whisper line. This not only helps me get 3 dimensions in my line work, but it also helps me out a ton when it comes to painting and rendering. And I also want to thank today's sponsor, me. And I've also hired Frank again to let you know about the Gumroad tutorial. Now, when I finally decided that, okay, I'm gonna get better at line work, my first port of call, like with most things with art, is to go on Pinterest and look up other artists. I start looking at work from Jin Kim, TB Choi, and Loish, and think this is absolutely fantastic. But then I was kind of stuck. I mean, do I just do copies and copies and copies of this stuff, hoping that one day magical line work fairy dust is gonna drop on me and then I'm gonna be good? What I really needed was some context. I needed new eyes. Now, the idea of new eyes is a really cool analogy about learning new things and how we can see things in different light at different stages of our learning process. And Adam Savage here explains it beautifully.
I love this idea about new eyes. You have almost certainly experienced it as well. So let's say you play the guitar. When you first picked up a guitar, it is a mystifying arrangement of tension, vibration, tonality, and you started noodling with it. You didn't have any point of view about how stiff the strings should be or what the tonality should be. You were just playing. And then as you got better at playing the guitar, at a certain point, you get past the beginner mode and you start seeing what you can't do and you start trying to burn new pathways to learn how to do those things you can't do. And at each stage, you are gaining new eyes. And none of this is stuff you could have possibly surmised the very first time you picked up a guitar.
And everything that I'm sharing online, including this video, is the result of getting new eyes and newer eyes and newer eyes again. So let's see how we can put this in the context of line work. I'm trying to find patterns. I'm trying to figure out, okay, why does TB Choi put her dark lines here? And why does Jin Kim put his lighter lines in certain areas? And as I'm starting to understand these patterns and see them out in the wild, I'm no longer just looking at beautiful artwork. I'm starting to get a little glimpse into how it was actually made. So when I sit down to study one of these artists, I can have a focus. For example, if I'm looking at Jin Kim's work here, I might try and identify where he puts his thicker and thinner lines. And then instead of copying, although copying isn't bad, I might try and replicate that on my own character, in my own context. I find doing that actually helps concepts stick rather than just copying straight out. Again, copying isn't bad, it's just something that I've found. All right, so let's get stuck into some of these new eye techniques that I've found when trying to learn line work. One of the more important things that I've found with line work is something called T-lines. They're called T-lines because they look like little T's. It really helps show the viewer and give the illusion that something is either in front or behind something else. This doesn't have to be an object necessarily directly in front of something. It could be a chin in front of a neck. It could be a nose in front of an eye. Once I started to see these T-lines, I saw them everywhere. Now when it comes to line weight, I want to think about why are we even using line weights in the first place? I'm trying to create an illusion to the viewer that this thing is a 3D object, even though it's just sitting on a 2D surface. You can see in this sketch here that there's a lot of line variation, and you're going to understand the thinking behind these lines later on in the video. But if we just make all these lines the same width, it flattens it right out, which, mind you, could also be a stylistic choice. So keep that in mind. Speaking of different styles, my mate Christian has made an awesome video about artists and their different line weights, and I highly recommend going and checking that one out after this one. Now, before we jump into my thinking around actually making these thicker and thinner lines and the whisper lines, and how they help me a lot with rendering and painting, Frank's going to really quickly talk to you about my Gumroad tutorial.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for the second opportunity. Okay. So, Ben has on his Gumroad right now a full 8-hour walkthrough tutorial, jam-packed with all the things about drawing this guy. From the sketch all the way to the painting. It's 8 hours, but it's broken down into 10 easily digestible chapters. He's also put together a 40-page PDF field guide, because the way that Ben likes to learn is not just through video, he also likes to read as well. So you get 2 times the value. Wow. He's also made some models for you, some 3D ones, so that you can start wrapping your head around the 3D forms. You can start to think in the way that Ben does when he draws, in 3 dimensions. Wow, looks like even more people have enjoyed it since the last video. Click the link in the description and the pinned comment. You know what to do. You look like a smart person. Whew. Okay, the second one down. Good one, guys. Good one, team. Beautiful. Okay, lunch break.
Great job, Frank. A bunch of you have given me some awesome feedback on the tutorial, so if you do go and check it out, I hope you get a ton out of it. All right, let's get back to line work. So we've talked about T-lines. We've talked about why we would even use line weights in the first place. Let's first talk about different scenarios where I might want to put these thicker lines. Oftentimes I'll make the outside lines a little bit darker, which helps the object, character, or whatever you're drawing stand out a little bit more. But you'll notice with these shapes that they're not all the same width. What's classified as a thicker line in the background might be a lot thinner than what's actually in the foreground. When I'm thinking about these thicker lines, there's no set line weight that I'm necessarily using. It's contextual to the scene and the character that I'm drawing. Another great scenario to use thicker lines is when objects overlap one another, and this pairs beautifully with those T lines that we talked about earlier. Using this stylized skull as an example, you can see that this side part here is overlapping everything else, and you'll see the jaw underneath it is actually overlapping the neck. These are some really good candidates to start adding those thicker lines to separate them. With a slightly more subtle example, you can see that the upper teeth are overlapping the lower teeth. So this could be a really good candidate to add one of those contextual thicker lines, just to show that those upper teeth are really overlapping those lower teeth. Now, another awesome scenario is thinking about shadows. Even if I'm working in line, I oftentimes like to think about the light source. It gives me a really good opportunity to add those more obvious cast shadows, like you can see here underneath the jaw and the nose. You've also got the really clear dark shadow of the inner mouth, but sometimes I want to add shadows where there isn't necessarily a cast shadow. For example, if the light source here is coming from the top, I might make a thicker line underneath the object. For example, here you can see on the nose and the ear, underneath is just that little bit darker. And you'll notice how it can transition to a lighter line. That's a key thing that I've found. The line doesn't have to all be one thickness. Now, another good candidate is around the corner lines. When I like to use these darker lines is when you can't see around an object. This is similar thinking to the outside line, but oftentimes these scenarios happen within an object itself. For example, with the indent on the cube, you can't see around these corners. So if I can't see around the corner, it's a good candidate to add a little bit of a thicker line. A more contextual example would be the ear. Depending on the view, we might not be able to see around that little ear bump or the inner lip of the ear. So we can add a darker line to really bring that forward, but you notice that this also transitions into a lighter line where we can see that inner lip of the ear. This transition between lines can really bring some dimension. All right, so we've talked about these thicker lines, but what about these whisper lines? They're my absolute favorite. They really help describe the form without competing with some of these darker lines. A great candidate for these whisper lines is where you can see two planes meet, the opposite of not being able to see around the corner, almost just giving a hint or a whisper to the viewer that this is a 3D object. You can see the nose here, you can see the top and bottom plane of the nose, and that edge between those two planes wouldn't necessarily be a good candidate for a thicker line. So this is where we'd place this thinner line here, and couple that with one of those outside darker lines, it brings another level of dimension. Absolutely love this effect. Another really good use case for whisper lines is something that I mentioned in my last video, that brow to eye socket and cheek to chin sort of leading line to give dimension to the head. And how this helps me with rendering is that it's describing planes, and planes for me are everything when it comes to creating the illusion of light and shadow. These whisper lines can be used almost as a scaffolding, giving us indications of where certain planes are and where to put the light and where to put the shadow. To simplify this idea, let's isolate the nose and let's make this grayscale and imagine the light source coming from the top. You can hopefully see how these whisper lines give me a little bit of an indication where the planes are, where that nostril edge is jutting out from the form, how that leading line is differentiating the front and side planes. We could even go as far as simplifying this down into a box. Now, there's no right or wrong way to do any of this stuff. I'm just sharing some of my aha moments or new eyes moments that I've discovered so far. So I hope you got some new eyes out of this. At the very least, I hope it was helpful. I'll link the sketch brush that I use for these in the description. It's free, it's nothing fancy. And if you enjoyed this video, I think you might like this one. I'll catch you in the next one.